Alright, let's take a closer look at white blood cells. First, let's start with what is leukocytosis? Well, it's a white blood cell count over 11,000 cells per microliter of blood. Now, this increase is a normal response to an infection. And when we're talking about white blood cells, we're actually looking at two major groups, but 5 cells. There's 3 granulocytes. They contain visible cytoplasmic granules that apply to their function. They include the phils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And there's 2 agranulocytes that do not contain visible cytoplasmic granules, and they're lymphocytes and monocytes. Now also keep in mind, you want to know what is the most abundant and least abundant cell when it comes to white blood cells in the blood. And a mnemonic that makes it easy to remember that decreasing abundance in the blood is never let monkeys eat bananas, because neutrophils are the most abundant, followed by lymphocytes, then monocytes, then eosinophils, then basophils. So basophils are the least abundant. Also note that while it's the phils for the granulocytes, it's the sites for the agranulocytes when it comes to what suffix you see where. Now, leukocytes don't make up the majority of formed elements. You actually find more platelets and red blood cells, or erythrocytes, in the blood. But there's actually 10 times more leukocytes made. They're just stored in the bone marrow. So here's a look at all the leukocytes. We see A, B, and C, which are the granulocytes, neutrophils, eosinophil, and basophils, respectively. And the agranulocytes are the lymphocyte and monocyte, which are D and E, respectively. Note that all of them except the lymphocyte have multi-lobed nuclei. And then we see the granules in the granulocytes, the 3 on the left, and not really a lot of granules in the 2 on the right. When it comes to the agranulocytes, they hold both the biggest and the smallest white blood cell. Lymphocytes are the smallest white blood cell, and monocytes are the biggest. Now let's talk about those granulocytes, and then we'll take a closer look at each. So there's 3 types of granulocytes: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Now they tend to be larger and shorter lived than red blood cells because they often die fighting. They contain lobed nuclei, still one nucleus, and they have cytoplasmic granules that stain specifically with right stain. And they're all phagocytic to some degree. Now, neutrophils are the most numerous, but they're also known as polymorphonuclear leukocytes. But we call them neutrophils more often than not because they absorb both acidic and basic dyes, so they're roughly neutral in pH. Now, their granules contain a lot of antimicrobials, hydrolytic enzymes, proteins, defensins, and those are going to be great at making the neutrophils very phagocytic. They're great bacteria slayers. So as phagocytic bacteria slayers, they kill microbes by a process called a respiratory burst. That's because a lot of the antimicrobial proteins they contain have oxygen or oxidizing substances within them, acting kind of like bleach or hydrogen peroxide poured on a bacterium. Now, the defensin granules merge often with a phagosome and form spears, and that's going to be the mechanism that this respiratory burst takes on to pierce holes in the membrane of an ingested microbe, like a bacterium. Let's take another look at the cell. Here you see 2 neutrophils, one on top of the other. They're both multi-lobed. They have anywhere from 3 to 6 lobed nuclei, and those lobes are connected by nuclear extensions, but it's still one nucleus, it's just multi-lobed. You can see the kind of light purple to lilac granules, and those are where we find the antimicrobial proteins and what it uses to produce that respiratory burst. Next, we're going to move on and look at eosinophils. Now, they only account for like 2 to 4% of all leukocytes. So if you suddenly have an abundance of these, which is a condition called eosinophilia, it probably suggests some inflammation somewhere in the body. These have 2 lobes to their nucleus, and their nucleus is going to be connected by a broader band than what we saw with the neutrophil. Sometimes that nucleus kind of resembles earmuffs, or an 8 with the circles filled in. Now, they have anywhere from pink to red staining granules, and they contain digestive enzymes. And they only release these enzymes to play a role in allergies and asthma, so they're immune response modulators, but they can also release them on large parasitic worms, and that starts to digest the worm's surface. They're really recognizable because of those pink to red granules, and then also you're going to be able to see that nucleus, which is bilobed. Next, we're going to look at the basophils, and they're the rarest white blood cell, but they do have a nucleus that is very similar to the eosinophil. It has two constrictions or two lobes. It's occasionally U-shaped, but it's oftentimes going to be overshadowed by the large purplish black or basophilic granules, and those are going to make up much of what we see of a basophil. Those granules contain histamine, and histamine is an inflammatory chemical that acts as a vasodilator, and this is actually going to help with leukocytosis and attract white blood cells to inflamed sites of infection. And basophils are actually similar to another type of cell that we find in the blood called a mast cell, because they both contain histamine, which again is that potent vasodilator. So again, you can't really see the nucleus here in this basophil. It's anywhere from bilobed to U-shaped, but what is paramount is the dark purplish to black cytoplasmic granules that take up all the space in the cell. You don't see any cytoplasm on the edges. All right, now that we've looked at the granulocytes, let's take a look at the agranulocytes. So of course, hence their name, they lack visible cytoplasmic granules, and they consist of the lymphocyte and the monocyte. Now, these have spherical or kidney-shaped nuclei. The lymphocyte is the second most numerous white blood cell, but the most important for immune modulation. It's crucial to immunity. We find its components T and B cells, or T and B lymphocytes, in lymphoid tissue like the lymph nodes, the spleen. We don't find as many though circulating in the blood. Now, why T and B lymphocytes are important is because they can either directly act against virus-infected cells and tumor cells, or give rise to plasma cells which produce antibodies. And that is going to be the main arm of what we call the adaptive immune system that actually responds very specifically to different types of pathogens, which are things that cause disease. Now, these cells themselves are going to have a large purple nucleus that takes up almost all of the room inside the cell. You'll really only see kind of a thin rim of blue to purple cytoplasm just outside that nucleus, but the cell on the whole is quite small. So here's our lymphocyte. It's the closest in size to the red blood cells. You can see the spherical or circular nucleus, and only a little bit of space where we see just cytoplasm that's lighter in color. Next, we're going to look at the monocytes, and these are by far the best phagocytic cells, but not in the form monocyte, which is in the blood. Instead, they actually are able to leave circulation and enter tissue and turn into macrophages. The process where monocytes and other cells can leave the blood and go into tissue is called diapedesis. And they do that by squeezing through the inside lining of blood vessels called endothelial cells, specifically where it's thinnest, which is at capillaries, which are only made of one layer of endothelial cells. Now, once they're macrophages, monocytes become actively phagocytic cells that are crucial against us fighting against viruses and other intracellular bacterial parasites. They really help a lot with chronic infections. Whereas neutrophils tend to be the first that show up at the site of infection, they often die fighting and end up in pus. But monocytes are able to work again and again and again, and they're even able to help us activate lymphocytes and mount an immune response. So here is our monocyte. It is the largest white blood cell, has anywhere from a kidney-shaped to U-shaped nucleus. And I would say kidney bean-shaped is a little bit easier to remember for the nucleus shape. And you're going to see quite a lot of the cytoplasm, especially in comparison to the other agranulocyte, the small lymphocyte. So here they are together. And so when you're talking about white blood cells, you're talking about 5 different types and 2 major categories. So make sure to review all of your white blood cells.